This is a special season. Not because I'm any more a fan of video games than other things, though thinking about it, I am probably, but because even with the restrictions I put on myself, the lineup of matches that I ended up liking came out so stacked, I struggled to balance this. In fact, this is the least realistic lineup I've come up with so far, just in terms of balancing Sprite to other styles. I even left out a matchup I would have really liked to put on, because I couldn't find reason to... I couldn't convince myself to. It's Clementine versus Ellie is the one I didn't put on. It's cool, I just don't know if I want to see either in Sprite. Although, I mean, even then, like, there are matchups on this list that I don't think should be in Sprite, that I've just listed as Sprite, for the sake of making a sort of more realistic looking season. You'll see listed Sprite and then in brackets, but actually 3D. Anyway, let's go, because I have a lot more to say about some of these than some of the other ones. Our premiere. This is one of the less thematic matchups and plays way more heavily off of the rivalry of the time, and I was around for that rivalry in those comparisons, so damn straight do I want it. Cole McGrath versus Alex Mercer. In terms of theme, the two are the protagonists of Infamous and Prototype, which has something of a history. The two were both compared and contrasted a lot at the time, being open-world action-adventure sandbox games where you use crazy powers to traverse a city through climbing and gliding, doing side quests and helping people, or fucking them up depending on how you want to play. And like, that might not immediately sound too similar if you're thinking those are some generic things, but at the time it was a pretty big deal, as those were relatively newer concepts for games, and they were released within only 2 weeks of one another. There were a lot of comparisons, and while I was firmly on the Prototype side, that was just because I never got to play Infamous at the time, which sucks, but what can you do? I still haven't gotten the chance to play it, but I do want to. This got to a point where even the developers themselves took note of it. I don't hear many people talk about this anymore, but Yahtzee, the guy who does Zero Punctuation, even struggled to decide which game he preferred, and jokingly said he'd give the award for better game to the team that can make the best image of the other game's protagonist wearing a bra. So they did that. They made funny images of the other team's protagonist wearing a bra. It was cool. I like it a lot. And Yahtzee even took this to heart and declared a winner based on just the images. It's fucking great. I love that the teams behind the games acknowledge their rivalry in a fun, light-hearted way, where they just had some fun with it. And so here we are now. Let's make them kill each other. In terms of their actual characters, I can't say much of what they have in common. As I said, I haven't played Infamous, but that kind of rivalry can carry a match for someone that lived through it. And I did, and boy was it fun. And also, the animation potential is kind of nuts. These two fuckers have so many things they can do, and the other guy being so different means there's a ton of power interactions that would never happen in canon yet feel right. Cole has a ton of lightning abilities to bust out. He's got a big sword arm, long range blast, draining energy from others and nearby sources, shockwaves, gravity blast, payloads of kinetic energy, and lightning storms, as well as ice powers that he can do a lot with. It's possible to give him his fire powers too, but I don't think they should. On Alex's side, he's got claws, hammer fist, whip fist, tendrils, shields, armor, a big ass sword he can form from his body, and can just be anything from individual targeting weapons to wide AoE attacks that span a massive area. He has various senses I'm unsure of the usage of, a ton of tendril attacks including bio-bombs and barrages. He's got flying kicks that knock helicopters out of the air, he's got big ground spike attacks, his own massive shockwaves, and potentially the abilities of people like Elizabeth Green who can become a big fuck-off monster, though probably don't give him that, but it's possible. I wouldn't, but he could have him if he wanted. There's so much you could do, and I think the characters even play off each other in some odd ways. Alex is, from what I know, far more physically impressive in terms of how he's portrayed. He sends heavy vehicles flying with ease, and he punt kicks helicopters into oblivion. While Cole is far more of an ability-focused character, which makes sense because Alex's powers are all based on his physical form, while Cole's aren't, so there's a fun dynamic to be had there. Most of all though, what I'd love to see is the two just travelling throughout a massive city set during the battle, launching each other through the skies, taking off and battling in the air, gliding towards one another to hit each other with their shit, and making the most of the big sandbox city element that made these games so often compared. And of course, make sure it's good Cole in the fight. I really don't want to see evil Cole in the battle, partially because it's not canon, partially because it's not possible for Cole to pull a Darth Revan and be both good and evil, and partially because Alex canonically is a bit of a cunt in the sequel. Cole is not, so that offers a cool hero versus villain dynamic that I'd like to see played off. Cole is good karma, so he's going around saving people while Alex is openly mass slaughtering as many as he can to consume their biomass. Maybe you could have a point where Cole gets a karmic overload from saving a ton of people, healing some injured people just on the way when he's running to attack Alex, and using less of his AoE moves when around large crowds, while Alex gets a massive power boost from killing a ton of people with his own AoE and consuming their biomass for himself, really not caring for the well-being of others. It sounds great, and I'd love to see it taken and just done to its fullest. I do love the match, and a lot of that comes down to a combination of some fantastic animation potential that can fully play off the rivalry and the big theme, the big sandbox theme. Have that be a part of it, and really get across that feeling of a crossover between the two. Shame it's never going to happen. Please let that comment age poorly. So I mentioned before that I'm not really big on talking about Fate in Versus anymore, because of just how frustrating the community has to be whenever I'm trying to talk about it. But I've also mentioned that there are 3 matchups in Fate that I still like and enjoy talking about, and this is one of them. This is on here solely to appeal to me, and I don't particularly care if any of you dislike it. It's Fina versus Mash Kyrielight. So a history lesson. First off, Fate as a whole is a video game franchise. Its first installment was a game, it's branched off a game franchise overall with Fate Stay Night and Fate Hollow Ataraxia. Its most played thing, like the most commonly interacted with thing in Fate, is the Grand Order gacha game, which is one of the biggest gacha games around. It's a game series. Secondly, Fina is the deuteragonist and main girl of Chain Chronicle, another gacha game that none of you have played, that holds a very special place in my heart for very personal reasons, and also cannot be played in the West anymore as the global servers were shut down in 2016. It also had a 50-minute OVA that was awful, and a film trilogy that was fine but spent too much time focusing on Artem, a nothing character never from the game created for the trilogy, that took away from focusing on the actual characters despite the interesting premise of a what-if timeline where the protagonist actually failed in the final battle. That trilogy's good, but only for people who are fans of the game, and even then they're not going to enjoy it all that much. Hilariously though, that wasn't even the first time that they did that, as the manga also ended up focusing on someone who was never in the games, known as Kaz, who is at least more interesting than Artem. The whole gimmick with Kaz is that he's a wizard that sucks at magic and thinks being a hero is nothing but fighting, leading to stories about the volunteer army fixing up damage, helping civilians, and generally doing good work across the world as for hire helpers, as opposed to just nothing but being the heroes that beat the bad guy. That's a much more interesting thing to me than Artem's gimmick of being the upstart dork whose thing is he sucks mana out from other people and just intrudes on more interesting stories like Yuri suffering from the blackening and becoming the Black Knight, or Fina struggling with her emotions, or Brukhard, the more interesting anime original character who becomes a demon and is not as important as Artem to the story. Artem sucks. Anyway, so after Chain Chronicle went down, the only game that ever came close to really taking its place for me was Fate Grand Order, where Mash is the main girl. While Fina was always one of my favourite characters in Chain Chronicle for her steadfast refusal to give in to villains despite not really knowing how to fight for a while, her little quirks and eccentricities that pop up every now and again, and as she was also my best healer for a while. Mash I always found just kinda lame until the Camelot Singularity, but after that she shot out to be one of my favourite characters as more was revealed, and she got a more assertive mindset instead of fading into the background for the whole time. As for the actual match itself, there is a theme here at least. Aside from obviously being the main girl protagonist love interest of their respective gacha games, both of them also wield immensely powerful mundane items that turn into battle equipment. Mash wields a table for a shield and Fina wields a book as a weapon, of which double in a meta sense as those two weapons, and well, like, could you call the round table a weapon? Anyway, the shield and the book are symbols used when summoning gacha pulls in the games. That's more of just a little bonus thing, wherein a big mystery is put on these items and how they're connected to the stories and characters. In general, their stories aren't super unique, but follow the same beats. The protagonist comes across them randomly one day and they seem like nothing special, then a big attack from bad guy happens and they end up teaming up to take down the main threat. Obviously, the hero's psych, I forgot what it's called now, I've just brain farted on one of the most commonly talked about concepts in storytelling. The hero's journey, you know, that's the inciting incident. That's the call to action. They realize that there's something they don't actually know about themselves that bothers them, and around the mid to ending portion of the story, they learn that actually they're bonded with a piece of immense power from history that facilitates all their capabilities after running into a deity from that power's past that explains what the fuck's going on. This helps them get a better handle on their power, and by the end they're facing off against an almighty evil being impersonating a figure of great power who reveals their true form as a monster thing. And the main girl helps the protagonist fight him because, I mean, of course she does. And then at the end there's just a sequel hook leading to part 2 where they go from defensive characters into more aggressive ones in gameplay, with Mash's part 2 form being the Burstbuster Autonax kit, and Fina's part 2 variant being an attack focused mage. It's not inherently super deep, but it does actually match Mash's story, unlike her other matchups like, what the fuck, now Fumi or whatever? I don't even know if I'm pronouncing his name right, don't care. Also, I forgot to mention it there, but the two stories also have a heavy focus on their relationship with time. I said the word and now I'm feeling pain. As Mash is running through time periods to save them and all of history, while Fina is carrying the collective chronicle of all time and is fighting to ensure the safety of it and all history as well. In terms of animation, I think what helps make this work to me is that Mash is a very defensive character. Sure, she can swing her shield around to bash people, but against most characters, you want her opponent to be a highly aggressive one, because the majority of what Mash is going to throw out is counterattacks and Lord Caldeus and Camelot to defend. And maybe going into the Ordinax midway to focus on attack if you want, but it's kind of clunky to work that in. In terms of what Fina can bring, it's a bit difficult because helpfully the anime trilogy just ignored all of her abilities, thanks. But obviously she is primarily a healer and a laser shooter. Along with that, she can summon massive meteor showers, she can bring out a magical staff to both heal and strike with, she can fire waves of dark energy, and though it doesn't necessarily help her, she can also summon creatures from the Black Army to fight. They don't fight for her though, so this would result in a Frank vs Leon situation where they're attacking each other and defending themselves against the army at the same time. Were I to be making the fight myself, I'd have it focus on Fina's long-range attacks, keeping Mash at bay until Mash can get close enough to swing at Fina, who struggles to defend with her staff and needs to heal herself afterwards. There would of course be that Leon vs Frank moment where they're fighting each other and the Black Army. Fina would decide to clear the entire area with a meteor shower that Mash uses Lord Caldeus to protect herself from. And then Fina would have the thing where the Chain Chronicle sucks people into the timelines contained within its pages happen. Either Fina does it herself, or she uses the Chain Chronicle to block Mash's next attack, with the two getting dragged into different timelines from each other's franchises. Potentially, you could have bits of a fight within the Moonsill of the Extra timeline, within the Burning Fuyuki of the Stay Night timeline, the alternate ending of the Chain Chronicle movie timeline. The Brave Frontier world would be a fun nod to its connection with Chain Chronicle, and possibly if I had the budget, I'd have warriors from their series that know the two crossing over to help as much as they can. Primarily in an ending where the two plunge back into time, either to like the time before time or the end of time, which would be an area modeled after Solomon's Workshop. They would have their final clash which focuses on the bonds they made with their allies along the way, as that is a very heavy theme of Grand Order and Chain Chronicle, summoning shadows of characters they're connected with that are similar to fight, such as potentially having the shadow of the heroic leader Wayne against the shadow servant of Leonidas, or a shadow servant of Gilgamesh clashing with the arrogant lord of 9 territories Shuza. You could have the just generally similar characters of Rafalgar and Iskandar clashing as well. And you would end with the final clash of all of the Chain Chronicle's power focused into a beam against the strongest defenses of Lord Camelot, overlaid with their respective goddesses of Rongominiad and Yggdrasil clashing in the background until one of them wins. Have that. It just sounds cool to have like these shadows of characters that they're bonded with, because it works into the whole Tales of Bonds thing, which is a big selling point of Chain Chronicle, and the massive roster of Grand Order, which is its big selling point. Just having all these shadows of similar characters clashing for a single hit each, as Mash and Fina are charging at each other, leading into that final attack. Compared to Mash's other matchups against overly defensive characters, I think this has far more interesting a dynamic to me. It also plays off Mash as a time traveler, as well as the multiple timelines of Fate, which is pretty good because Grand Order is sort of a celebration of the Fate franchise as a whole, and having that element of Grand Order represented is awesome. It also could bring in all these other characters in brief cameos to just sort of represent the core theme of the bonds they have across the stories. Both of their tales involve characters from all sorts of different cultures coming together as well, which is sort of another main theme of Grand Order and Chain Chronicle. I've spent enough time talking about this. It's one I most wanted and one of my favorite matchups of all time. Also, a good friend of mine made this, which is a custom track art for the matchup, and I will link him in the description. I think he's still open for commissions. Oh, maybe I'm just a really bad friend and didn't keep track. That's always possible. For episode 3, this is probably weird to some, given they don't have too much in common, but I can explain the reasons here. Bang Shishigami versus Chip. I always hate pronouncing his last name, because I always feel like I'm doing it wrong. But basically, Chip and Bang are some of my favorite characters from either series, and the potential for insanely silly moments mixed with unreasonably hype moments kind of makes the fight for me. In terms of connections, it really isn't much. They're fighting game ninjas from rival series that have basically the same vibe, but that's basically all John vs. Saberwolf was in terms of thematic deepness, so I don't think it's too much of a problem. I guess when it comes down to it, Bang and Chip are not very deep characters, so you can only go so far with thematics. I really don't think there's much I can do to sell this matchup beyond. It's a simple fighting game matchup with a lot of fun animation potential. Both these two, while taking themselves quite seriously and being quite goofy a lot of the time, also have their genuinely hype and cool moments, as well as some dynamic supers that go all in on being quite over the top in presentation. As long as there's a good balance between the two having their goofy fun moments and serious badass moments, I'm good. I had less to say on this than I thought. Episode 4. In many ways, Jack vs. Travis is a lot like Alex vs. Cole, though the rivalry is not quite as big and wasn't quite as prominent. It's a match carried by a softer rivalry, and how often the games were compared as unreasonably brutal Nintendo Wii games at a time when nobody really saw them coming. Also, the games are pretty absurd. The two really, to my knowledge, are similar in that the premise is some anti-hero goes around killing people to climb their way up a ladder and reach number 1, which to be fair, is still more thematic than John vs. Sableball. A lot of what carries this fight for me, however, is that it sounds like a really fun animation. Having it in that Mad World art style where it's all black and white aside from the blood and Travis himself could make for a very visually unique and dynamic animation that stands out from the others for its unique aesthetic. And I like when episodes can stand out like that. In terms of how the two clash, Jack is a fairly simple character while Travis is a bit more wacky, even having a mech suit. But the thing is that I don't think that's too absurd for Jack. He does fight a mech suit called Martin in Mad World, so it's not like anything Travis has is too absurd for Jack given what's in Mad World. I also think interacting with the world of Arrogant City could be fun as well. Having Jack weaponizing people that are nearby against Travis and trying to get Travis sent flying into the death traps would be really cool, and it would play into the characters. And of course, the bread and butter of the fight would be focused on sword fighting, or I guess lightsaber versus chainsaw fighting. Mix that with the jokey Travis and the overly serious Jack, giving us a fun dynamic, and I do quite like how this matchup sounds and how they bounce off one another. And given Travis pretty openly wins this, I'd love if the ending involved him regaining the upper hand in a way so dramatic it causes Varrigan City to change art styles to full color to match No More Heroes, with Jack being the only one in his traditional black and white style, sort of representing how Travis is taking the #1 spot from Jack and making it his city before he kills him in some brutal fashion. I don't know, it sounds fun. I'm kind of a sucker for these old rivalries that aren't just platformers. Episode 5, Skylanders is poggers. Here's Pop Fizz versus Plague Knight. If I have to explain, then you are already lost, but this is mega base. They use potions and shit, man, and Pop Fizz is awesome. I don't know what else to say. If you don't like it, then that's your problem. Episode 6 is one I have very little to say on, but I don't have much to say. It's Bomberman versus Earthworm Jim. I don't know. The biggest appeal of this is that you have a character that blows shit up against someone who causes a big bang by running too hard into someone else. It seems neat. At least it's a matchup I can put in Sprite without feeling weird about it. Episode 7. I mentioned Big Box vs Nick Fury not long ago, and I also mentioned Solid as Snake vs King Bradley, but here's the third Metal Gear matchup that I'm interested in. Genji vs Grey Fox. The theme here is former assassins that were forced to fight someone close to them against their will, who lost pretty badly and would later get cybernetic enhancements, and a new, more neutral outlook to the person that beat them up. Something like that, I'm not super knowledgeable. What I do know though is that this would be a pretty cool animation. I think a quick-paced ninja sword fight focused on the two evading and blocking each other's strikes and avoiding as much direct damage as possible would make for a cool dynamic. It'd be a lot of fun and hopefully capture a similar high-speed vibe to Wolverine vs Raiden. I can't speak much to what specifically either character brings unique to them, or what banter, if any, there could be, or what shots or trading of abilities would be cool, or what iconic scenes they could have that would be referenced in a natural way. I don't know any of that. I just know it sounds cool and has a lot of appeal to it. Episode 8. So initially for this one I had Rathalos vs Charizard, and depending on your view of things, you can put that back in if you want, so this is honorary place to Rathalos vs Charizard, but I want to put in Mewtwo vs BlackWarGreymon. Now I know that BlackWarGreymon technically debuted in a card game or something like that, and is most prominent from the anime, but Digimon's a game series, so if you're going to be an anal asshole like that, well no, if you're going to be less anal, then you would just put him as video game. You'd have to be really anal to actually specify the fact that he's not from a video game himself, but yeah, it's Mewtwo vs BlackWarGreymon. Now, instead of like explaining the matchup itself, because I feel like a lot of people would understand the whole clone thing, I'm just going to say that, to me, this matchup does have a lot of important value, as the Battle Royale for it was the very first, and as of yet only, voice audition I've ever done that I actually got the role for. So the matchup holds a very special place in my heart, and honestly, I'd love to see it as a death battle, though it would be pretty sad to know the fact that I will not be voicing Mewtwo in it. Obviously, I would not be. I'm nobody. But it'd be cool. Episode 9. I want you to know that of all episodes, this is one of the ones I would want in 3D the most, that it's only listed in Sprite for the sake of this stupid season gimmick. It's the Prince of Persia vs Altair. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people wondering, why not the Prince vs Ezio? And truth be told, there's a few reasons. From what I've heard, Prince just works better with Altair in terms of the fact that Assassin's Creed is considered a spiritual successor to Prince of Egypt, and Altair was the first protagonist of Assassin's Creed. And also, Altair is a character wherein the Apple of Eden is a bit more reasonably standard than with Ezio. While Ezio has had it before, it's something generally you'd have a better time arguing as Altair's instead. Ezio would be a lot more interesting focusing on the more grounded elements of Assassin's Creed, which I don't find too interesting bouncing off the Prince and his time shenanigans. I honestly feel the only reason people bring up Prince vs Ezio more is just because Ezio is the fan favourite, but I've always loved Altair. He's my second favourite protagonist in the series behind, well, Ezio, and honestly he'd be a pretty big draw for me. I played every Assassin's Creed game up until Black Flag where I stopped, which does mean I got to go through Altair's game and then the Ezio games. And I have that attachment to those games, which makes me really invested in seeing them in Death Battle someday. I don't have as much of a connection to the Prince, as in I don't really have any, but not only does Altair not have any other opponents, I also think this is just one that works well enough for me. Series versus series spiritual successor, both of which match aesthetically and vibe and blah blah blah. Seems you could do a lot of interesting stuff with their powers, and without their powers too for the earlier bit. Obviously escalating to them including more abilities as the battle goes on, with potentially several interesting fake-outs. Ezio can get his time another day, but as it is, I don't really like most of his matchups. Episode 10. This is one I've talked about before that I won't waste your time with. It's Kratos vs Dante. This is the rivalry that I personally have had the most experience actually in. Most rivalries I didn't get too much into discussions over compared to a lot of people, but the Devil May Cry in God of War 1 was pretty huge and it was all over the place when I was younger. I get into a lot of arguments over who would win between Kratos and Dante. You know how some people get into those playground arguments, Goku Superman, Mario Sonic? For me that was Kratos Dante, with such lovely arguments as one kills demons but the other kills gods, which are stronger, and Kratos is clearly trying a lot, which means he's putting in more effort than the relaxed Dante. Really stupid arguments that hold about as much water as a screen door. But those are fond memories I have, not like I have many other fond memories. And in terms of just as a fight or episode, of course, I think it'd be incredible. These two have so many weapons and abilities at their disposal, and the style of their games makes it a perfect match for quick switching and comboing that could be fast-paced and exciting with a fun dynamic between the humorous and jovial Dante and the serious and aggressive Kratos. I don't want to talk too much about it though, because I've already talked about it before. It's a match that holds a lot of meaning to me, and I'd love to see it happen. Even if I'm not entirely sure Dante needs a rerun. Though Kratos does need a rerun definitely, and of his options I like this one the most. I know ours already exists, but I'm not a fan of that dynamic, just in general. Episode 11. For the mid-season return, I also swam with one that I've already talked about before. It's Liu Kang versus the protagonist of Killer Instinct. Thematic, rivalry, good animation potential, so on and so forth. I don't think it needs to be sold to people, right? Episode 12. This is a matchup that recently I started to get invested in again, because I replayed Dishonored, and it remains one of my favorite stealth games of all time. With Dishonored 2 in the air, as it might overtake it. I remember not liking Dishonored 2 the first time I played it, but I'm enjoying it a lot more in my second go, and I will make my judgment when I'm done, but I really do enjoy Dishonored 2 as well. This matchup is Booker DeWitt versus Corvo Atano. What can I say? Bioshock is a series that I've not played as much as I want to, but I fully intend to after I'm done with Dishonored 2. The theme is something like magical heroes with powers on their hand in fantastical Victorian settings who blah 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 a thing, with what's totally not their secretly their daughters to keep her safe. It's strong enough to work for me, and while I could say I'd like something that also includes Dishonored 2 in its theme, that's really more of an Emily game than a Corvo one. From what I know, Booker does play off Corvo quite well, and if you're wondering why it's listed as Sprite, you can read. I would much rather this episode as a 3D one, in-house or Blender, I don't care. Corvo in 3D sounds more interesting. To my knowledge, Booker's abilities are like he can levitate people, which might play off well off Corvo's teleporting blink. He can summon a murder of crows, like Corvo can summon a swarm of rats. He can fire out elements, much like Corvo can shoot wind. He obviously has a gun like Corvo. He can make himself block gunfire, which would probably work off Corvo's weaponry and lead to a moment where Booker tries to shoot back, but Corvo avoids it by stopping time. And also, Booker can apparently fight with a vending machine, which I guess would mean it'd be funny if he does that to Corvo. Corvo can possess things. I don't know if you'd be able to work that into. Maybe. I used to not really be into this because I always did low chaos ghost runs in Dishonored, but having recently gone fuck it and just played through a high chaos run, I'm now a bit more accepting of the idea of Corvo in a fight and killing someone. Especially as I think mid chaos is the canon ending. At the very least, he definitely took some lives in Dishonored. So it's definitely acceptable to me with all that too. And honestly, I think it'd be cool to get this even if neither series are particularly relevant currently, because I'd love to see Dishonored get on, it'd be great to have it. I recognize Corvo vs Ezio is also an option, but as I said, I'd like Ezio to stick with his general gear and no Apple, and I don't think Corvo would be too great against that. It's not bad, but Booker just sounds more interesting to me. For episode 13, I originally had a matchup for Senator Armstrong here until my microscopic brain ticked for a second and realized that that's another Metal Gear guy, and I wanted to do as little of that repeating as possible, so here's Serious Sam vs Duke Nukem. It sounds fun. I really don't think I need to explain this one. It's pretty obvious what's going on. They're both really dated action hero style video game protagonists, and it could be the cheesiest shit ever, yes? Episode 14. I've talked about this one before, but let's bring it back. It's Gordon Freeman vs Isaac Clarke. I have an idea on the theme now. They're scientists, shooter game protagonists with power armor who suddenly get thrust into horrific alien conflicts. That seems cool. I'm something of a scientist myself, given people have told me my information on radiation in Godzilla vs. Hulk has helped them in college, which... Really? That's weird to think about, man. Anyway, I like this matchup. I think you could have a really cool horror atmosphere with it without letting go of any of the action. Something that matches the action horror stylings I hear their games have a lot. I don't know, I've only played Dead Space 2 and only very briefly, but I like this one. Support this one. Sounds cool. Time for Isaac to hunt down the Freeman. Episode 15. So I do have someone else to talk about this one. It's Bendy vs Cuphead, and here is a wonderful friend and person, Ribbit, to talk about it. Why'd I say it like that?
There was a point in time that I would have shaken the idea of this spot off, since the DBX was just so phenomenal, but I think time has only helped this matchup become even stronger. Bendy vs Cuphead is a very popular matchup, easily the most popular for both, but doing it as a death battle is a little more complicated thanks to what might be the most beautifully animated thing ever put on the Death Battle channel, being this match on DBX. But that fight, while amazing, was a lot more character focused. The two barely fought, all things considered. Both land like 2 hits across the entire thing. I personally think this worked to the fight's benefit, but in Death Battle, we could see a different style, more akin to Popeye vs Saitama or Mario vs Sonic 2, with more fighting and more usage of their abilities. I also think that Bendy as a character can be approached similarly to the DBX, seeing as he's technically 2 different characters. One Bendy is animalistic and monstrous, the other is happy-go-lucky. Just discuss both since neither are exactly chock full of feats, compared to Cuphead at least. Not to mention, in a Bendy comic, Boris eats a majority of the moon, and in the Cuphead show, Cuphead pulls the moon. So you could approach the cartoon Bendy fight with gag feats and the ink Bendy fight without them, which would do a good job at differentiating the two matchups even more and making them even more interesting. Also, we haven't really had a Toon Force user fight another Toon Force user on the show before. It's usually Toon Force users versus a more grounded fighter, with Macho Man vs Kool-Aid Man pretty much being the closest I can think of, but that episode is kind of a special case. I want to see a fight that can go all the way with cartoon hijinks. I've seen them do it brilliantly with Popeye, so I know it would be amazing in execution. Another thing to mention is that both the Cuphead game and the show have sections that use actual modelled backgrounds, because Studio MDH are absolute legends. And god, do they look beautiful. After Macho Man vs Kool-Aid Man's claymation looking segment, I almost wonder if Luis could work some of that magic to have some modelled looking backgrounds for some shots of the fight, but I might be putting a little too much pressure on the episode at that point. I know it's easy to look at the DBX and consider that the peak of what this match can be, and for what it was, it absolutely is. I don't think that they should try to replicate that one's magic, unless they got the original folks back to animate it, but if you want to be on par with something amazing, play to your own strengths. The Cuphead show, in my opinion, looked almost as good as the game, even though it wasn't fully drawn by hand, because it played to its strengths and focused on exaggerated expression work and super fast movements, which I think the Rooster Teeth team could honestly pull off. If the DBX looked like the Cuphead game and the Death Battle looked like the Cuphead show, I think we'd have a very good compromise. I would love to see Cuphead appear on Death Battle, it's my favourite video game of all time, and I honestly do adore the look and designs in Bendy's game, so I would love to see both get the spotlight here. Also subscribe to Biff Week.
Episode 16. So this one is here because I couldn't think of a better Sprite episode that I had anything to say on. It's fighting Fafnir versus Viper again. Once again, I've talked about this matchup before, and it really is one of those matchups where it's primarily about the vibe to me. These two have just vibed the same way and would make for an awesome animation where it's like throwing their boss battles against one another in a high-paced explosion and fire-filled action-packed battle. This is one I'd be tempted to animate myself, and honestly, I feel like this is probably better as a DBX because of the characters not really having a lot to talk about for an analysis. But when it comes to sprite matchups that I thought that I could think of that I wanted to add in, this is the only one that I had any strong feeling about. Episode 17. I don't have any really strong opinions on Team Fortress 2 in its matchups, but this is neat. Medic versus Richtofen. I think that's how you say it. I think it's cool. It just seems neat, and I think Call of Duty is one of those series that would actually be really interesting to see on Death Battle, because it does have that sort of very negative reputation, but I think it would be cool to see like a serious analysis on it, as long as they don't do any of that sort of shitting on Call of Duty thing, which I think has died down a little bit. At least I don't see it as much as I once did. So that's cool, and I'd like to see that, taken seriously. You could check out Red Runner's video for a better idea on the plots of this matchup though, so I'm here realizing how little I have to say about some of these, really, even when I think they're neat, especially near the end. Toad's Undead vs Last Dragonborn. It's neat. I hear there are problems with using the Last Dragonborn, but I'm not terribly bothered because I never played Skyrim. I think it's at least a neat aesthetic and it would be cool as it's like a classic fantasy fight. We don't get many of those, and high fantasy is one of my favorite genres, along with hard sci-fi and complete nonsense. I don't know what you could do because I barely know the characters, but I know for a fact the cutaway gag would be either Boomstick doing a Fusroy Dart on Wiz, or Wiz making a subwoofer that can do one on Boomstick. Or maybe it'll be an unfunny attempt to subvert expectations by having it fail, and then one of them will say something dumb after it fails. That's not going to be very fun to see, but hey, the fight could be cool, and it could be a very unique sort of fantasy battle, and I like fantasy. Episode 19. Steve vs Terrarian. What else do I have to say? I think this one could be one of the most creative and interesting animations, and I don't really know what to say on this one either. I guess the biggest thing to say is I don't know how the animation would go. Like, what style would they do? I don't think 3D would be great, but I do think Sprite would work, because Steve has been in Sprite before. But with the whole portal thing that Minecraft has, you could probably have it go into 3D as well. Like, have them go into a portal into another dimension. That's like a combination of the Nether and Hell from Terraria. and you can have that be in 3D, which would be neat, because their different styles of building could be represented as well, which would be cool. I also do have quite a strong connection to both of these games for completely different reasons, and this debate can be really interesting with the right people. You know, the ones that aren't assholes about Minecraft, be they against it or for it. Though you could say that for all matchups, but this is one of the ones where the disparity between the fun times I've had talking about it and unfun times is one of the biggest. I do wonder how they do the arsenals, but I think it'd be cool to see the more grounded Steve and his equipment against the Terrarian who's very out there. Because while Terrarian has way more weapons and shit going on, Steve is way more of a builder than the Terrarian, and I think it'd be cool to have his building abilities bounce off against the wider arsenal of the Terrarian if they're creative with it, which I hope they would be. The biggest thing with this matchup, be creative, you can do so much. And now let's get to the finale. It's Bowser vs Eggman. And this is one of those ones where my interest in it has greatly changed over time. At a point I thought it was just another Mario vs Sonic matchup, not worth doing, but as I thought about it, I realized maybe that was a bit silly. Mario vs Sonic is one of the biggest rivalries in versus generally, and we haven't had one in a while, and I don't need them to do a ton of them. I wouldn't want it to be sort of overplayed like Marvel vs DC, but sometimes it's nice to have a satisfying final battle in a rivalry this big, and Bowser vs Eggman is the one I go for this like a big conclusion. This is it, Mario vs Sonic is done on the show. This is what we're ending it on. I also like the choreography you could have, as well as banter. Bowser and Eggman are some of the most charismatic and likable video game villains when they're at their best. Pitting Bowser's idiotic traits against Eggman's intellectual personality could be really funny, especially if they can balance out the goofiness with them being serious threats, because they can be that at the right times. And for animation, not only could this be a cool army battle, but also just cool as a one-on-one. But as an army battle, I think it'd be really interesting because Bowser is more of an in-the-thick-of-it combatant, while Eggman would be more sitting back commanding. And it'd be interesting to see Bowser bust out some of his rarely used abilities, namely ones rarely used in versus animation, which is... In versus animations with Bowser are basically always just smash abilities and hammers. That's it. Against Eggman's army of robots, I think you could do something cool. Of course, you'd end it with Eggman himself getting into the battle too, with both the Death Egg robot and maybe something else like the Egg Dragoon. You could also have the airships that Bowser has against the Egg Fleet, potentially a giant or Fury Bowser reacting and stopping or dying to the Death Egg's big death laser. It'd be a cool interaction. You could actually use the Death Egg here. I think you could do a lot very interesting with it. And I do think that sort of animation could be really cool. Maybe even have Bowser and Eggman's army battle be in sprites to make it a little bit cheaper, and then have Eggman use the Phantom Ruby to try and fight back when Bowser gets closer to him and gains the upper hand, causing it to switch to Blender for the final portion. If you need to cheapen it, I think you could work that. Either way, I do like this matchup now, and I think it'd be cool. And that was the video. I'm genuinely really tired, so I'm gonna go to sleep actually. It's quite late. Have a good one, fellas.